Hello and welcome to day 4 of this year's Leeds Opera Festival. My name is David Ward and I'm the Artistic Director of Northern Opera Group. In this afternoon's online event, it's my great pleasure to welcome the opera writing team of Lewis Murphy and Laura Attridge to join us to chat all things writing and opera and to look forward to their new work, Arc 23, which will be premiering in Leeds next July. So firstly, I'm going to check that both of my guests are with us. So first off, hello Lewis, are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here, David.
Very nice to see you. Where are you calling us from today?
So I'm calling you from my flat in southeast London, missing the sunshine. And I never thought I'd say that.
Yeah, we've had about 10 minutes today in Leeds, but that's fine. That'll top me up for the next few days. And also on the line, we should have Laura Attridge. Are you there, Laura?
Yes, hello.
Hello, and I'm very pleased to say that you're joining us from a little bit closer to Leeds. You recently moved back up north?
Yes, I've moved back to York, which is where I spent my teenage years. I'm very happy to be an official Northerner again.
Good. Well, again, big fans of anyone that comes back to the north of England. So welcome back home. Before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of opera writing, let's start by taking a look at some of your work in action. So this is the lullaby from your opera Belongings. Would one of you like to just kind of very briefly introduce the opera and what it is that we're going to hear?
Yeah, so Belongings was commissioned in 2015, 2016, but first performed at Glyndebourne in 2017. It's an opera about displacement and human connection explored through two stories, one of a group of World War II evacuees at Glyndebourne and one of a group of modern day refugees. And these groups kind of go on their independent journeys, but there's a suggestion that they kind of intertwine. And yeah, it's about displacement and conflict, but ultimately about hope and optimism and the positivity of human connection. And it was first performed at Glyndebourne and then subsequently revived at the beginning of this year in Minnesota. And this little extract, this lullaby, is at a point in the opera where the group of refugees are anticipating the next step of their journey. So it's something that is both something to be anxious about, but also hopeful.
Fantastic. Well, let's hear a little clip of Belongings then. So this is from the Glyndebourne production. So let me see if I can get this to work. A really beautiful clip there. Thank you for choosing that one. So my first question is that you in the orchestra pit there, Lewis?
It wasn't me. No. I did, I think, once have a go at conducting my own work in college, but soon realized that when I'm trying to follow the music and keep an orchestra together, I lose the ability to count up to 4. So, even the simplest kind of meters were suddenly beyond me. So I surprised myself with how poor a conductor I was. So since then, I've left it to the professionals. So in the pit there, those hands belong to Lee Reynolds. So he was a great kind of mentor to both of us actually, and to the kids through the whole process. And then yes, he conducted the final performance.
Well, that's one of the things I always find really interesting, that you can spend so much time intricately writing these operas, every single note, every single word, and then you can just quite happily hand it over to someone else to put it on the stage. But we might come onto that subject a little bit later. Actually, just before we start, over the lockdown period, you've both been working together on this Notes from Isolation project. So very briefly, what is that you've been doing? And tell us a little bit about the fantastic kind of coterie of singers you've got on board to work with you on the project.
Oh, I just bounced out, but I bounced in time to tell you all about what I think you've just asked.
Just in time, yeah.
So Notes from Isolation really came out of the experience that I was having in lockdown, which was feeling very artistically frustrated, but also feeling as a human being really, really helpless, really sort of feeling a bit passive, like things were going by, and I had sort of a lack of autonomy, a lack of being able to do anything about what was happening, and sort of lack of outlet for expressing what I was experiencing as a human and as an artist. And was becoming aware that a lot of my friends who were artists, but also friends who particularly were performers, feeling like they just had a part of their identity stripped away, and they were likewise feeling like the thing they had to offer to the world was not able to be experienced anymore. They weren't able to give that thing and be themselves. And I had this idea, and it was really when I was at a point in lockdown where I finally started sort of to have ideas again, to feel creative. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to empower some performers to share their experiences as artists and as humans, and to create a legacy almost of this sort of I guess time capsule of these songs that are created through collaboration in isolation, and embody these little moments in the singer's experience that they've had. And what was amazing is we decided we would interview each performer, and write directly in response to what they talked about, and to bring to life a little piece of that experience. What was extraordinary was every single one of them, at some point in the conversation, however difficult the experience they've been sharing and what we've been talking about, they turned to a moment of joy or of hope. And it became very apparent about 3 interviews in that this was the thing that needed to be at the heart of the project. So every one of the songs is a moment of hope, a moment of not just necessarily pure, unfettered joy, but a moment of hope that was found in lockdown, where they had a sensation of looking forward to something in the future, even if that future is a challenging one or a difficult one. And it's been such a privilege to be party to those conversations, which are often, I think, very therapeutic for the performer, and then to have the honor of bringing those experiences to life through song, which again was done very collaboratively back and forth with the performers themselves, to make sure they were happy and they felt we were representing them in a good way. So singers, we've got the 2 songs we've got out at the moment, from Nikki Spence and Natalia Romanu, and we've got one from Katrina Morrison about to land. We've then got Julian Van Melletz and his partner Sofia Castillo, who is a flautist. So we've got a duet there, which is gorgeous. Then our second set of 4 will come from Isabel Peters, David Horton, Marta Fontenot-Simmons, and Dame Felicity Lott.
Fantastic. Well, as you say, a couple of those songs are out there already, so do go and check those out. It's a fantastic project. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So let's get into writing an opera then. Let's start at the very beginning. What is the kind of the usual process for actually kind of getting that opera put on or starting on that journey? Do the 2 of you have a huge bag of ideas you take around with you, or is it very much trying to respond to commissions and things kind of coming out at the very start? Kind of how does this process usually kick off?
Well, I guess every project is different. I was just as you were speaking there, David, I was trying to think about how each of our operas has kind of begun life, and some of them have, well, they've all developed in very different ways. I mean, generally, yes, we do have a bag of ideas that we can kind of pull from, but that's more a recent thing. And for example, Art 23, which we'll get to later, we're thrilled. I mean, obviously thrilled to write this piece for Leeds Youth Opera anyway, but particularly thrilled because it's an idea that we've had and that we've been passionate about for a while. And it's great to be able to bring that idea out and for that to have life and for us to realize that. So I think that's taught us not to throw anything away. Even if an idea doesn't immediately have life, it's not necessarily an idea that you should discard. Keep it. It will be right for someone someday in some context. So we keep our ideas bag kind of filled, or our Google Drive folder, filled with ideas, because who knows. But generally, the operas that we've done have begun with a bit of a blank slate. Normally, we will respond to a brief from whoever it is that's commissioning it, whether that is kind of a full-on commission, straight up, we want you to write this opera, these are the forces, and then we can respond to that. Or if it's some of the operas that we've written have been through the kind of the process of a competition. For example, the piece that we wrote for Scottish Opera and their education group was basically a call for scores, where they were looking for proposals for a youth opera. And generally the brief is quite a loose one. It is, we are looking for proposals for an opera that will put young people, quite often a large group of young people, right at the center of the action. So that gives you your parameters straight away, and then we have to kind of work within that. With the example of that piece that we wrote for Scottish Opera, that I think we were both quite pleased with how we were able to use the chorus in that way, because it was quite unusual for us. We came up with the idea of using the chorus as the embodiment of this kind of artificial intelligence, which was quite interesting for us to explore. So it doesn't bind you in any sense. A large group of performers on stage can be used in infinite different ways, but generally we will start with those parameters, to come up with a story that involves a large group of young performers on stage, and most of whom need to be on stage most of the time. Normally, the spaces in which these operas are performed don't always allow for kind of frequent passages of large choruses on and off stage. Glyndebourne had wings, but I think that might have been the only thing. So you're having to think about large groups of people on stage most of the time, and then the next stage is, okay, well, what kind of scenarios could we imagine that would fit those parameters? We've never actually had a brief from an opera company that suggests a story, or we have had a theme. We have had a brief of a theme. When we wrote a piece for the Opera House, the brief was still very loose, a large group of young people on stage, but the theme was coming of age, because it was about their anniversary as well. So they were interested in coming of age. So we could respond to that. And I think we've just gotten into the routine of that over time, from experience of listening to what the Opera House wants or what the company wants, and then responding to that. And then from there, we can go wild with our own ideas. But it helps initially to just have some kind of parameters set for us.
Can I ask about that bag of ideas? I mean, Laura, what does that look like? Is that just sort of snippets of story, or do you kind of write little lyrical segments? Lewis, do you write little musical segments? What is that kind of bag of ideas? How much are you tempted to write little bits and bobs as you're sort of coming up with things?
It's primarily narrative. So it's if it's an interesting news story, if it's a folk tale or a Wikipedia page or something that one of us has gone, oh, that would make a good opera. It's at the moment a very loose Google Doc that we both can add to with either just a link, if it's a quick, I've seen that and I need to keep a record of it. Sometimes we've done a bit of work, for example, for a pitch or for a for an opportunity where we've fleshed something out. We will keep all of our previous pitches or previous synopses or whatever in that same file. So it can be, we've got everything from a sort of fully formed pitch idea for various things to a single Wikipedia link. And it just depends really what comes up as to which we develop into something fuller next. But it tends not to come with too much sort of artistic development along the way, because that for us would come at a later stage of development anyway, once we've got a commission.
And I mean, what's interesting about the two of you is that you are a team, you know, Murphy and Attridge, that sort of brand. You also do a lot of work together. And does that sort of division of ideas, is that sort of quite an equal kind of distribution? I suppose most people would often think of a librettist maybe kind of coming up with story elements, but do both of you very much kind of share in that idea gathering and Google Drive adding and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's obviously parts of the process where we each get to specialize and do what we love doing best. So there will be a point in the process where Laura will go away and she'll write and then come back and show me. And there will be a part of the process towards the end where I will go away and write and then come back and show Laura. But there will be a part of the process prior to all that happening where we will just just talk a lot about ideas that are interesting to us and other ideas that are connected to that, and kind of follow the web and think about things in probably quite broad terms of, you know, what we're wanting to achieve. What is this about? Why this? Why is it an opera? You know, that's one of the questions that we've come up with a lot. You know, how do we tell this story? Do we have the right or the authority to tell this story properly? Those are other, you know. So there's a lot of chat, but a lot of kind of questions that are asked in those kind of early days of an idea.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, maybe it's a difficult one to answer in sort of a minute, but you know, how do you know what is an opera? You know, what will make an opera? Is there something kind of special about that, you know, rather than it being a play or whatnot? What does a story have to make it operatic?
Mm-hmm.
It is a difficult question. I mean, for me, it's a bit more of a holistic thing. Like if I look at a story and I think, that feels really operatic, it needs to be an opera rather than a film or a piece of theatre. It's quite hard to quantify. I think there are definitely some narrative things. Interestingly for me, I think in the writing stage, with something like Arc 23, it's the most exposition and world building I've had to put into an opera that we've ever written. So it's really helpful if something is immediately recognizable and understandable, because you don't have to put in lots of narrative exposition, because the story takes longer to tell. You have less text in a single scene than you would in a play. You can't just have a character, you know, making a long speech. Like an aria is not that much text. I'm always trying to make it as simple perhaps isn't the right word, but bring as much clarity to a narrative as possible. So if the story is just too complicated, particularly for the form that we've worked in thus far, which is quite short one-act pieces, it probably isn't something we can do. Of course, if we're talking longer form, then there's much more storytelling you can do. But we tend to look at things which are really really clear, I think, in terms of story and of narrative arc, so that it's as easy to convey as possible, and then we can enjoy the act of the storytelling rather than having to spell out everything to an audience.
I think that's really interesting, that idea that you don't have time in opera to kind of spell it out. So how you set that world, how you have clarity in relatively few word is a really interesting challenge, I suppose. I should say, if you're watching along at home and have any questions for Lewis and Laura, do pop them in the chat and we'll get to them throughout this afternoon. So, Laura, looking at the writing of the libretto, then we've talked a little bit about some of them there, but what are some of those practical considerations as a librettist? Or do you just kind of put onto paper, kind of what you fancy, or are there certain rules that you have to be following?
So Lewis talked about briefs. I love a brief because often a brief will really guide you towards, again, my buzzword, clarity, because otherwise you're just kind of flailing around in a world of, well, we could just do anything. I love having those restrictions, which often help me figure out how a story can be told. So for something like Belongings, we knew that we had this massive chorus of kids, and we also had a really wide age range and range of abilities. We wanted to make sure that there were enough small step out solo roles, sort of named roles for the kids. We wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for the younger kids to have their own stuff to do sometimes. So I'm thinking sometimes I put my director's hat on and I think like a director and think, well, what's practical? What's going to be stageable? What makes it easier to rehearse? And so it really made sense for us to split the chorus into two smaller groups of about 30, 35 kids in each, in order to make sure that each of them got their stage time, in order to make it easier to direct. It made sense to have two groups of children in two different narratives in a practical sense. So I'm thinking in that way, thinking, who's moving about on stage, who's got whose narrative when, where are the relationships there, thinking of the end product. And then other considerations, I guess that I like to get a really clear narrative structure in place before I start writing. Some people like to put pen to paper straight away and get some of that going. I'm quite a planner, so I have big tables of scene structure that I put together, and I send to Lewis, and I send to anybody on the commissioning team who is inputting to that to make sure that they're happy at that stage, as you know, David. For me, that allows me to work out lots of really important things, particularly when you're working with a large chorus or different forces, so that I can sort of see, well, that's going to be a chorus followed by this aria followed by this duet which goes into that chorus, and it allows me to sort of balance what I think is going to end up on stage. It also sometimes allows Lewis and me to have really important conversations quite early on about what might happen and how we might develop some of the musical language as that comes out. And then in terms of moving forward from that, I will find a way in to the scenes that feel like they can be realized quickly or feel like they're at the heart of the piece. So with Belongings, we wrote two choruses for some workshops very early on, one of which was the lullaby, which to me is just the heart of the entire piece. And one of my favorite things that we've ever written. It was that, and then there was a chorus for the evacuee kids as well, which we wrote very, very early on and just became the themes of the piece. Whereas for Arc 23, as you know, I jumped straight in a series of scenes between one of the main characters and a computer, and I wrote those to get myself into a sense of the language and tone and style of the piece, which allowed me to then build outwards from those scenes. But then I had to come back at the very end and completely redraft each of those scenes, because what I'd written for the rest of the piece no longer fitted what I'd originally developed. So one thing helps me get to the next thing, and sometimes I have to go back and redraft. But I tend to fill from the inside out because I've got that structure in place. And then if I need to move around, that's fine. I did move some scenes around from my original structure for Arc 23, for example. But it's fitting in all those elements and then making it singable is the next challenge, and then passing it on to Lewis.
Yeah, so first of all, full disclosure, yes, I've been involved with Laura and Lewis in Arc 23, so I know a little bit about it already. That was really interesting what you just said there, making sure it's singable to pass on to Lewis. I mean, what does that mean? How do you know when something's singable?
So I tend to, when I'm testing the text, I will sit and I will read it out loud. I won't sing it, but I'll read it either in a rhythmic way or in a way that I'm feeling the breath through the words, where the consonants sit. So if it's something that you might trip over as you're saying it, it probably won't sing very well. I discovered very early on in my writing career that the word lungs is impossible to hear from an audience perspective. It's really hard to sing because you don't anticipate the end of the word. There's a bit of finding as you go, but so it's making sure that it's communicable. That's the word she said. Yes, that it's easy to understand at the other end for the person who's hearing it. That it's easy to use the breath to go through the line, and what I've been doing more recently is enjoying playing with meter and with rhythm. We found that for some of our most recent pieces, actually, when I write a chorus very rhythmically, Lewis really enjoys the directness of that rhythm, and he often comes up with something particularly catchy if I've written quite rhythmically. So it's fun playing with rhythm, and as much as that sort of ties me down to something in a way that sort of free verse doesn't, it actually often ends up with the most earwormy kind of catchy things from the piece. And Lewis, one of Lewis's strengths really is creating tunes that you remember for days afterwards, and I love being able to facilitate that. So I'll write perhaps quite metrically and with some rhyme. I do quite a lot of internal rhyme to match vowel sounds is quite satisfying when you sing it. So I write like that for choruses, and then when I come to sort of arias and things, I just loosen that a little bit so that it's a little bit more free verse, but you still have ties of some rhythmic, really satisfying rhythm in there, and vowel matching and unexpected internal rhyme. Lewis has come to me and gone, oh, I just noticed a rhyme in that line that I didn't know was there because I said it out loud, or I was setting it and I discovered little intricate vowel matching across that. So that's fun, that in terms of the way that you can play with language and think about the vowel sounds that a singer will be producing. So as I should have prefaced all of that by saying I trained as a singer, so that helps me a lot. I think a lot of it's instinctive, but so some subconscious stuff and some very conscious decisions into making it singable.
And you never tempted to sing along to the libretto? I know I'd be terrible at writing a libretto because I just write all the music in my head at the same time. But are you very good at just trying to stick to the words, make it singable, but not have a little running, soundtrack in your head? I
sometimes get a little sort of rhythmic thing in my head, and I like speak it really rhythmically, and then often Lewis will set it completely differently and wonderfully. But I've sometimes come up with a little thing, and I go around the house kind of saying it. But composition was never my thing. And it's sort of is that incredible experience of Lewis sort of sometimes feels like he reaches into my head and pulls out the music I would have written had I any ability to compose, which is sort of extraordinary and such a privilege to just know that he's going to be able to do that.
So before we get on to writing the music, then we've had a question which is a really, really interesting one. How do you decide what voice type each character is? Is there anything that decides which character is which voice? I suppose we have our archetypal opera characters, the buffoonish bass, or the sort of, the light, airy soprano, sort of daughter sort of type character or whatnot. But when you're writing, how do you know this is a soprano, this is a tenor, and who decides that sort of thing?
I think I tend to decide that. Is that right, Lewis? I mean, or at least in conversation with you.
I mean, I think like those kind of operatic cliches that you've mentioned, David, are still really, really strong, and I think they're really helpful in opera. The voice sends a really clear signal to the audience that this character is, might not be like that, but we can associate her or him with these qualities because you have heard similar voice types singing, and their characters have these qualities. So, for example, in Belongings, we knew that one of the characters had to be a mezzo because she was a kind of a mother figure, a teacher, these kind of qualities, more kind of grounded, more maternal, whereas the soprano was a little bit freer, a little bit more kind of headstrong, I guess. And the male character, whether he was a baritone or a tenor, I guess it was just that was a freer decision, that one. But yeah, generally Laura is very, very, very good at identifying which voice types are going to be more appropriate for which characters, because at a much earlier stage in the process, she's getting deep inside those characters and actually building them. So it makes sense to decide what voice type, what voice they're going to use to sing with, as as those characters are being built, I guess. And I'm more than happy to be told, this is a soprano, this is a mezzo.
Well, it's often a discussion when we're developing those characters, because they
absolutely,
they just feel like that voice type. I mean, it goes much beyond going, well, that's a soprano. It's, well, is that a dramatic soprano? And if so, I need to write text to serve the kind of music that a dramatic soprano would sing. So I know when I'm writing the text, I know that I'm writing for a particular voice type, and try and match the quality of the text to the sort of aria or duet or music that they might sing.
That's really interesting. So just letting the character tell you what voice they would like. Really interesting. Yeah. So, Lewis, you're given all the words. Where do you start? There are so many notes, so many different ways that you can kind of put them all together. How on earth do you start writing music for a piece?
Well, so in many different ways. I mean, it depends on the kind of time scale that we've got for the project. I mean, if we've got room for workshops prior to us even starting work on the libretto or score proper, Laura and I will have a chance, as we did with Belongings, to just create little sketches of things. And that's useful just to explore. Often it's good to hear the participants sing something. You can get an idea of their standard and what they like, what they go for, what they don't go for. But you hope that these sketches will inform the composition of the rest of the piece, that you can thread them through as little themes. And that is one way of going about it, thinking about, okay, what are the key points in this piece musically? What do we want to send people away with in their minds? If we had to sum this up musically, what would those little bits of music be? And decide what those are, and then kind of let them develop quite naturally as the piece goes on, and see where you can find the opportunity to thread those in. But generally, the way that I've kind of taken the beginning of a new piece, once I've received the libretto, is to look at the key, because we've been writing for chorus most of the time, to look at those key chorus points, those chorus numbers, as the main musical moments in the piece, and start with those. And we will have had a discussion about this at the beginning of the whole process. So we will know kind of number by number what our kind of, if someone was to buy the Belongings greatest hits, what would it be on the back of the CD? So we have those numbers in our mind, and I can start with those in whatever order. And then generally just try and kind of connect them up. So the opera evolves as a process of kind of big musical numbers with transitions in between. And obviously what's satisfying is that those musical transitions can be themselves developments of material from musical numbers, either earlier or later on in the piece. So generally, as you go, you start kind of creating this oneness in the piece, because yes, you're creating these hopefully very individual musical moments, but you are threading them together, but you're reusing material from all over the place so that generally the opera takes on an identity all of its own. And that's that's generally the way that I've enjoyed working the last couple of projects that we've done. It's been very satisfying to start with those big chorus bits that I can get my teeth stuck into, and then let the opera kind of be built from them.
I mean, earlier on, we mentioned this idea of, what is an opera, what is operatic. I mean, if Glyndebourne say to you, I'd like you and Laura to write me an opera, do you think differently than if they came to you and said, I'd like you to write me a musical? Or if they said, I want you to write me a song, is there something different in your mind as to what that means in terms of your writing?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean,
for me anyway.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think certainly it was interesting with Notes from Isolation going back to song. I mean, the first project that Laura and I did was a song project when we were at college. Since then, it's been all narrative-led opera, and now we're kind of, or recently we went back to song for this project, and it was interesting to just examine how it was different. And I think that there certainly are differences when I'm writing song compared to when I'm writing opera. With the music that I'm writing, things are more condensed. You're not concerned with big stretches of development. So you can kind of, I don't know, you can maybe just play more and let things go, things happen. You don't need to worry about what's going to happen to that little motif in 20 minutes time, because the song is only a minute and a half long. But I think a lot of it is the context as well. I could sit down to write a 2-minute aria, and I could sit down to write a 2-minute song for voice and piano. But because the aria has that context within the opera, I think it will feel like a very different process, because I'm sitting that within the context of a much larger piece. I don't know if the music necessarily would sound different, but certainly as a process, it feels very, very different.
And what is your kind of writing process? Is it a 9-to-5 sort of job, or is it taking inspiration when it comes? How do you approach the actual sitting down and doing it sort of side of the business?
No, it's very much a 9-to-5 kind of thing, and that was instilled in me very early on. I mean, as an undergraduate at the Conservatoire in Glasgow, it was instilled in me. I remember professors saying, "This is a 9-to-5 job." Essentially, they use those words. I think it's very, very alluring, this kind of idea of any artist, not just the composer, but the composer or the poet or the painter or whatever it is, taking inspiration when it comes, and working when that inspiration comes, and generally kind of letting life happen in the meantime. But that's such a luxury, and actually, if you wait for that, you're never going to meet any deadlines. There's no point in setting any deadlines, because you could stare out the window for 20 years and never write anything. So it's a bit of both. Obviously, the music comes more freely when you're inspired by something, by a story or a character that really, fires your imagination. But it's important just to keep writing every single day. Some days are easier than others. Some days it just flows, and some days it's a bit of kind of backward and forward. Some days you end up actually having kind of, some days you'll write maybe a minute of music, and maybe the next day you'll discard 2 minutes of music that you wrote the previous week. So it can be a little bit like that, but the important thing is just to kind of try and set yourself a time where you start work, try and set yourself a time when you end work. That's the difficult thing, actually, especially when you're in the middle of a piece, to set yourself a time where you actually put it away and stop thinking about it. But certainly it's important to think of it as a job. And I find personally that that's what helps me be productive, especially when there's lots of things going on, and life is so busy anyway, that I feel like I need to be quite kind of regimented with myself, and I could be better at that, actually, being regimented and having a 9-to-5 job, doesn't mean that you're immune from the draw of Netflix, with your lunch or anything like that. Suddenly you realise an hour's gone by.
Only one, Lewis. I don't think you should feel bad about that. Before we move on to talk about Arc 23, which is obviously very, very exciting. We touched on this briefly earlier, but that process, you finish the libretto, you finish the music, it's all come together, you've got your wonderful piece. I mean, what is that moment like when you sort of hand it over to the director and the conductor, and how much do you like having a role to play once it sort of starts to get into rehearsal, and how much you just try and let them iron out the problems that they might find when it actually gets on a stage?
It depends. And yeah, it normally goes back to the very beginning of the process. If we've been able to have a conversation with the conductor and the director along the way, as actually we've had with Arc 23, which has been fantastic. If we've had those conversations, then generally it doesn't make us feel quite as anxious handing that over, sorry, at the end, once we've done our work, because there's an understanding, and we've been able to collaborate with those people through, along the way, so they know what it's about. What's a little bit more tricky is when there's not been that opportunity for a conversation along the way, and then suddenly you're handing it over, even if you know the person, but they don't know the piece. They're effectively a stranger to the piece. So you've got to find an understanding, and hopefully one can be reached before they then start, creating their ideas, because everything needs to be in response to the stage before. Laura will write the libretto, then I'll respond to the libretto, then I'll hand over, and then the director will respond to both those things, and then the conductor will respond to everything that's been put together. So yeah, as long as there's some kind of understanding, it's generally fine, and it's stress-free.
So one of the next pieces you'll be handing over is Arc 23, which will be premiered in Leeds next year by Leeds Youth Opera for their 50th anniversary. Laura, what is Arc 23 all about? So
Arc 23, am I allowed to give some specific synopsis?
I don't see why not. Let's do it.
Hurrah! So Arc 23 is set on a spaceship in a fictional future in which the Earth is on a slow decline due to climate change, towards complete human and certainly animal and plant extinction. And this fleet has been put together of arcs, so 24 arcs sent into space, each with a different specialism on board necessary to creating a new colony for humans. So it's slightly experimental, but it's a measure put in place across the globe in order to try and make somewhere habitable to start shipping the rest of the human race out to before the Earth implodes or explodes or completely fire and flood. And we join the ship of botanists and the story begins when the ship stops getting communication from Earth. And we follow what happens when the group of botanists gathers that the captain hasn't, for whatever reason, told them that this is going on. And these people who've been traveling for nearly 2 years on this shuttle start responding in different ways to their fear of the unknown, of what might be happening, and why they've lost communication with Earth. And so it's a wonderful setup, because of course you've got sort of unity of time and place. We follow, we sort of have all the action within a day or half a day. You have a big division between the crew, who are all volunteers, and the botanists, who are all recruited, maybe through some shady ways, to get them on the ship and out on this mission. You have a group of kids who are a little microcosm of what the grown-ups are doing, and you have a sentient computer in the ship's hold who is very interested in what these humans are doing. But we were, as Lewis said earlier, this was an idea that we've been working on for a little while, and had come about through a different opportunity brief. And as he said, it clearly, it wasn't right for the time, because we could not have come up with a more relevant narrative to be writing right now, and when we're all in these small spaces, very afraid of the unknown and what's to come. And we really wanted to explore, as we do with most of our pieces, this sort of central question or idea with Belongings, which was very much about empathy and human connection. This is very much about human behavior in the face of the unknown and of fear, and the choice that one has to behave in a certain way when faced with fear. And it's been very cathartic to be writing about my own feelings and experiences in lockdown. But I hope that it asks some great questions, but is also some really great entertainment. We've got some fun, I hope will be fun musical numbers in there that have really come out of that narrative. Really excited to see it take shape.
Yeah, well, full disclosure, I've read the libretto. It's fantastic, and it is going to be, I think you're quite right, Laura, kind of thought-provoking, but very entertaining, very tense, very gripping. It's kind of I kind of see it as a thriller, really. But a really, really terrific piece. Just kind of very, very briefly, you mentioned at the start that in an opera it's quite difficult to set a world with so few words, and you've spoken here about spaceships going off, botanists, Earth, diet, that sort of thing. I mean, very kind of briefly, how can you do that? Tell that in an opera? How do you? What kind of tips and tricks do you kind of have to tell such a big background in relatively few words?
So what's particularly difficult, well, the challenge I set myself with Arc 23 was that usually for exposition, you have an outside character come into an environment that's very familiar to all the other characters. And because that person doesn't know any of the information, you get the other characters to tell them, which is great. Whereas in Arc 23, everyone's been on this ship for nearly 2 years with each other. There's no reason for the captain to say, I am the captain, and today we're doing this, and this is what's happening. So there's a lot, it was quite difficult to fit that all in, because you don't want the audience to be sitting there worrying about not having understood parts of the narrative, or having missed our chance to be very clear about the climate change message, or the question about fear. And it's trying to find ways to make things explicit without making the audience feel like they're being patronized. The computer was a really, really helpful character, in that the computer had lots of questions for the engineer character who's there trying to see check for malfunctions. So you have the computer who's this sort of figure who is the stranger in some ways, who's able to get lots of exposition from the engineer. And also, because you're not in big chorus scenes, you're able to have a bit more of conversation rather than a sort of set chorus number. I also figured out a really exciting way for the kids chorus, the group of kids, to be singing about their own history. So I came up with a little rhyme about the 24 ships that were sent out from Earth. and to just get a bit of exposition in there so that it's really catchy, so the audience will be thinking 24 ships were sent into space, etc. And so you're getting those bits of narrative fed to you perhaps in a really simple way, and then after the kids comes the engineer scene, where you have some basis of understanding and you build upon that with more detail. That was one of the cases in which originally I'd had the engineer scene coming before the kids, and I realized that if I could drop in bits of exposition with the kids before the engineer scene, my audience would be much more able to understand bit by bit what was going on. So there's really boring things like making sure you introduce people's names as early as possible. We achieved that with a scene that literally is called Good Morning, Captain Anderson. And so we learn Captain Anderson's name through that chorus. But there's an opportunity to say, oh, good morning, Dr. Fisher. Good morning, Dr. Linley. So we hear those people's names a few times and then we're able to pick them up. So I think there's repetition, there's drip feeding rather than throwing it all in at the same time, and there's layering understanding. And there's also things that you have to trust that a good director will do. I can't lay out all of the stuff in the text because actually the music is doing at least half the job, and the director is doing at least another half on top of that, and that makes my maths terrible. But you have to trust that there will be really clear things. If we're clear enough in the text and in the music, the director will be able to fully realize on stage and tell a visual story in its realization.
Some very interesting tips of the trade there. Interesting what you're saying there, introducing characters. I remember some really poorly written plays in my youth where the first few pages would just be, oh, hello, Steve. Oh, how nice to see you. You know, but you've done it much better than that. Lewis, so just a kind of a quick question for you. So obviously this is set in space. It's got that kind of sci-fi element. I mean, kind of generally speaking, I mean, how do you kind of go about researching for these kind of different topics? Does your musical style change a lot depending on what you know, kind of the narrative might be or the setting, or do you kind of have a musical style that you kind of stick to? I mean, how does that kind of inspirational research kind of work for you on a piece like this?
Well, I mean, I think for this piece, I think it probably will adapt, because there are some specific things about the environment that it would be very interesting to explore. I mean, like the sound of the machine, of the computer, the sound of all the kind of the systems on board. It would be interesting to kind of explore that both through the chorus and through the orchestra that we've got. You know, it'd be interesting. You know, these are decisions to be made a bit further down the line, but once we know what kind of percussion is available and so on, then we can start thinking about, okay, how do we set the scene in terms of the sound that we create, you know, and make it a 3D kind of experience for the audience. But generally, the style of the music is something that I'm aware of and will adapt to a certain extent, but not too much. It's never something that I'm kind of super conscious of. Generally, I will take the words, try and understand the kind of the intent behind them, try and understand the emotion of the scene, and then see what happens. And as I said, with this, probably a lot of those ways in which we can kind of reflect the sound of the spaceship in the orchestra will be something to be considered much later down the line. I mean, even after the piece has been written, you know, because there are certain stages, even within my own work, I'll probably provide the vocal score, maybe while I've started to think about the orchestration, but the orchestration will still be a work in progress. And then from that point on, it will be interesting to see what kind of colours are available to create this world, because we've never written a piece to be set on a spaceship before. So it'll be interesting for me to think, how can I make this really unique? You know, how can I build a world that for me is completely new and that will hopefully be very exciting for an audience, because this is a journey. into the unknown for everybody, this piece.
Well,
can I jump in and
oh yeah, go ahead.
sorry.
Yeah.
I'll just jump in and tell you a couple of my favorite Lewis insights into Lewis's compositional process, if I can, Lewis.
Yeah.
One belongings and one then to the elements. So I think Lewis and I both work in quite a holistic way in that we sort of follow little tunnels of research and ideas down, and I think they sort of percolate into things that find their way into the piece. The first of which I discovered was in Belongings, which completely blew my mind. Lewis had found, and you can correct me the title if I'm wrong, a Bach chorale called, in translation, the title being The Lamb Goes Forth Bearing the Sins of the World. Is that right, Lewis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And he'd worked this chorale into sections of the piece, not in a way that that you would necessarily know, but if that happened to be your jam, you'd recognize it, and also you could check out the program notes. But it just this core of emotion to this chorale, which summed up so much of what the opera was trying to say. These children bearing the sins or the transgressions or the wars of their adult counterparts, which I just found so extraordinary that he just did this. I mean, it wasn't to be flashy, it wasn't to be clever, but he found an emotional core in that to explore through some of the themes. So that was one thing that just blew my mind. The other was when we were writing the piece for Scottish Opera, then to the elements, and we were exploring a sort of AI character. Lewis just casually mentioned to me that he had been thinking about how computers communicate, and they communicate using, or at least used to dial tones. And he thought, what natural creature communicates through sound? Oh, I'll go and listen to some bird song. And he'd been out and notated some bird song and come back and use that to inspire the voice of this character. And it's so beautiful to get those little bits of information, but it's not something he didn't even mention them, but they find their way in there, and it's such an exciting thing to just find where some of those little things come from.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think with every piece I do try and cast the net quite wide, and sometimes things come up out of the blue. Then I'd kind of take everything in, and then everything is hopefully kind of channeled through what I hope is my own voice, my own style. But yeah, I enjoy Googling essentially, and kind of finding references for things.
Well, I look forward to hearing where the computer comes from. You both done an excellent job of selling ARC 23. I can't wait to hear the final thing next year. So thank you both very much for joining us this afternoon. It's been fascinating to hear about how you go about putting an opera together, and hopefully getting a few little tips and tricks for people out there as well. We've got one more day of the Leeds Opera Festival tomorrow, 10 a.m, the last of our daily vocal workouts with Phil Wilcox on YouTube. At 1 o'clock, I'm talking to the leader of the Orchestra of Opera North, David Greed, on his 42 years with the company. At 3 o'clock, we're talking about researching opera. How do you go about digging into opera's history? And at 6 o'clock, we'll be announcing the programme for the 2021 Leeds Opera Festival. All of those events free to watch on our YouTube channel. Everything in this year's festival has been free to watch and attend. If you've enjoyed the events and would like to make a donation to Northern Opera Group, you can text NOG, N-O-G, to 70085 to donate £5, or visit our website. Just before we go, a huge thank you to Lewis. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to hearing some ARC 23 music, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Yeah, my pleasure, David. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. And Laura, been great to have you with us. All the best for the rest of the notes from isolation stuff over the next few weeks.
Pleasure to be here. Great to see Lewis. I haven't seen him in a while. Good to get us together.
Reunite the team. Thank you all very much for watching. Thank you to Lewis and Laura, and we'll see you tomorrow for the final day of this year's Leeds Opera Festival. Goodbye. And we're not live anymore.